It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us is Rick Becker, here to talk about the patron of codependents. Thanks for being here, Rick.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Kyle.
So tell us, who was Saint Sampson of Dole?
Okay, Sampson of Dole was a Welsh saint in the 6th century. He was a monk and an abbot, and then a bishop and a missionary. And according to the hagiographers, the people who study and write about the saints, he was a pretty big figure back then. And he's not, unless you're Welsh maybe, you probably have never heard of him, or your listeners have probably never heard of him, but still commemorated throughout Europe, especially the British Isles, and there are a number of parishes throughout Brittany and France and on the British Isles that are named for him. So, yeah, he's. I've discovered that there are tons of Wales is like Ireland was a machine in terms of creating saints, and I was happy to find about his story. His story is really an interesting one.
And so, how did you originally stumble across him? Or were you researching something particular?
Oh no, actually, what I do, and this is, I'm going to reveal a secret right here on the radio, but sometimes when I'm thinking about something to write, I'll just take out a dictionary of saints and look at a day that's coming up on the calendar, and I'll look up all the weird saints that I've never heard of, and then start to look into them, and that's often how I come up with something to write about. So, it was July 28th was his feast, and a couple of days before that, I looked up July 28th, and that's how I started finding out about him. But it wasn't just, as you read the story that I had got posted on Catholic Exchange, it wasn't just Saint Sampson that I found out about, but one thing led to another. I found out a little bit about a figure, another monastic Welsh saint called Peer, who was Sampson's abbot when he was still a young monk. And so it was actually a twofer, and the interesting thing about Saint Peer is, as you saw in that piece, is that it appears, based on the legends and the chronicles from that period, that Saint Peer had a drinking problem, and in fact, it led to his death. He got so drunk one night that he fell down a well and died. And that's what led to the piece. I wrote a little bit about Saint Sampson, but what I was really interested in was this connection between Saint Sampson and Saint Peer, because in a monastery, an abbot, the name abbot, the title abbot actually does mean, it's from the word for father, and an abbot becomes a father, very real type of surrogate father for the monks, under his rule or under his, in his community. And it made me think that if St. Peer was a father figure, had that role of father in the community, and also had a drinking problem, it's very, very similar to the kinds of relationships that many of us have had to experience growing up in alcoholic families, and I would include myself among those.
Yeah, so in your article from Catholic Exchange, you said a patron for codependents. And right. So maybe, can you explain what that term means, codependent?
Yes. First of all, let me just let me give a disclaimer. I'm suggesting that he would be a patron saint for codependence. I think
Sure.
It's appropriate. But the term codependency came out, I guess it kind of surfaced, I'm not an expert on this, but it kind of surfaced in the 70s and 80s. And the idea is that the alcoholic, and this particularly with regards to addictions, particularly alcoholism, but other forms of addictions, but that the person who is dependent on the substance, say the alcoholic, in my case my father, is surrounded by people who are affected by his dependency and become codependents in a way that creates it's like a ripple effect of the dependency, the addiction that affects those around them, especially those who care about him, and they become codependent and develop behaviors that are unhealthy. So they're not dependent on the substance themselves, but because of their relationship with the dependent person, the addict, they develop unhealthy behaviors because of their relationship with that person. And part of my healing, I grew up in an alcoholic home. My brother and sister and I, and my dad was an alcoholic who was sober off and on, even up to the end of his life. God bless him, rest in peace. But we became, in a sense, enablers. We kind of we held the secret, and we covered up some of the odd, erratic behaviors, and we just kind of, you kind of suck it up when you're in a family like that, and try to get along to get along. And what happened for many people who are in that type of codependent relationship, one of the most common features, or a common feature, is that you blame yourself. That it's you develop the idea that my dad wouldn't be like this, or our family wouldn't be like this if it wasn't for me, if it wasn't something about me. And one of the keys for people who are suffering from codependency and some of those behaviors is to really develop a new way of thinking, that this is not, the dependency and the addiction is not because of me, and I need to be healthy. I need to take care of myself, especially if I'm going to truly help this addicted loved one in my family. So it's a lot like I tell my students. I'm a nursing instructor, as you know, Kyle, and when we talk about back injuries and back safety in nursing, because you're dealing with heavy. Nurses suffer from back injuries all the time, and what I tell my students that you need to take care of your back first before you can take care of others. You have to make sure that you're safe first before you can start taking care of your students or your patients. And that's true for people who are in relationships with people who are dependent on a substance or on addicts. You need to take care of yourself first, or else you're never going to be able to help the people who are sick around you, including parents who are alcoholics.
We're talking with Rick Becker and talking about codependence. And can you explain a little bit about how Saint Sampson of Dole fits in? Yeah, you mentioned a little bit of his habit of having an issue with alcoholism, or at least alcoholic tendencies. How did Saint Sampson of Dole deal with that?
It appears, and again, I'm teasing stuff out of the annals and the chronicles and the histories. But it seems that regardless of what he actually did while St. Pierre was still alive, the abbot was still alive, and seems to have, again, been struggling with a tendency toward abuse of alcohol. Once he died, and St. Sampson was himself elevated to the abbacy to become abbot, and he saw in the community, St. Pierre's community there in Wales, the dysfunction and the terrible the culture that had developed under Abbot Pierre, possibly related to his alcoholism and his failings, that St. Sampson found that community so resistant to reform that instead of trying to gut it out, again, out of a sense of guilt or a sense of obligation, that he just left. He took off, which is a big deal for monks, for abbots, because you take a vow of stability. He saw that the dysfunction in that community, I'm guessing a codependent community of some kind, was irredeemable. It was not reformable, at least not by St. Sampson. And for St. Sampson's health, he had to leave. He had to go to a different community, which he did, and that led to his flourishing, not only in his personal life. He became a bishop and became a missionary throughout the British Isles and into Brittany. But clearly that flourishing affected all those he came in contact with. So again, I see that as kind of a model, because as you know, I mean, we don't talk about it a lot in the church, but living in alcoholic homes where we have loved ones, people that we love and we want to care for, we want to see them flourish, but they're suffering and they're not making good decisions, and they're not making the kinds of choices that will lead to their health and their balance. That sometimes this whole idea of tough love, we have to be careful. We need to care for ourselves, and part of our becoming holy may include things that from the outside might appear to be harsh.
Sure.
And clearly, these are things that need to be grappled with in consultation with not only confessors and priests, but also professional counselors. Mm-hmm. Not every priest trained counselors, and they will refer you if you're dealing with these kinds of things in your household, in your home, your families, to those who will.
Yeah, and you have several different suggestions and tell a little bit of your story in there and some book recommendations. Would you mind just sharing a few things if somebody is dealing with it? I feel like so many people are affected by alcohol abuse, and if it's not in your family, you probably know somebody that is dealing with this. What suggestions do you have for people that might find themselves as codependents?
Well, the first thing is honesty. If you're familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 steps of AA, the first step in the 12 steps of AA is admitting, for an alcoholic to admit that he has the problem. So honesty and transparency and acknowledging the reality is always the first step. And that can sometimes, believe it or not, that can sometimes be the hardest step. To just acknowledge, my dad has a problem, or my wife or my son has a problem. Mm-hmm. That's always the first step, but first step in the battle. But like I suggested, taking that next step would then be to get help. And even before confronting the person who in your life that might have an addiction problem, a dependency problem, getting the kind of help that will give you the language, will give you the approach, may be the best next step rather than confronting the person directly. This is the kind of thing that it's really, really tough to do on your own. You need those who are familiar with the challenges involved to give you good counsel. And finding a good counsel itself can be a challenge. So that's why I suggest that you talk to your pastor, you talk to your confessor, tell them what's going on. They'll pray for you, and they will hopefully, most of the time, will be able to give you a suggestion as to a good counselor. Mm-hmm. There's also groups. As I mentioned in my article, there's groups for people who are in relationships, spouses, other family members. Al-Anon is one. It's an associate kind of program with AA for family members that are trying to figure out how to cope with a loved one's alcoholism. So those would be some steps. And, of course, a prayer. Can't leave that out.
Sure.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the beginning.
Well, encourage people to check this out. It's an article from Catholic Exchange, A Patron for Codependents, Saint Sampson of Dole. And also within there's a link to an article that you wrote about 6 years ago called Inebriate Me, which is another fascinating read. So people can check that out over at Catholic Exchange. Also, check out Rick Becker's work by doing a search for God-Haunted Lunatic. Find his blog and more. So thank you so much, Rick, for joining us again and another fascinating article that you put out.
Well, thank you, Kyle. Thanks for having me on.